You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to a Stimulus Tech Talk. I am here as usual with Stimulus Technology CEO Nathan Whitaker, and today we're going to be talking about a subject we've brought up many times in the past podcasts, but we haven't gone into in depth, and that is creating a disaster recovery plan for your business. Good afternoon, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry. It's good to be here. I apologize for my change in background. The advantage of remote work is to be able to kind of work from anywhere, and I happen to be sitting in my kitchen this afternoon, so rather than my usual spot because my office is torn apart at the moment. So advantages of technology today, for sure.
So let's start out by talking about what a disaster recovery plan is, because we're talking about cybersecurity, not just natural disaster, although you probably need a plan for that too. So can you go over what that is?
Well, I think a disaster recovery plan is any plan that you put in place when your business gets interrupted from normal operations. And so it's not necessarily an IT disaster recovery plan. It is a disaster recovery plan. And this could encompass anything from, like you just said, natural disasters to a cybersecurity event, the heck, a pandemic that happens, and I'm sure very few companies had a COVID-19 disaster recovery plan before the beginning of 2020. But I'm sure a lot of companies have something in place today to get through that. And so it's just basically if your normal business operations get interrupted anyway, what are you going to do about it? And that's what the plan is.
All right. And so why is it important for a business, a little more in depth on why should a business have this in place?
Well, I think any size business, whether you're a one-person operation or 1,000-person operation, needs to have at least an idea of how they're going to continue generating revenue and income and keeping their employees going if normal business, normal operations can't happen. So that's any, common things you got to think about is like, if you have a power outage or your office gets displaced, because of a move or something like that, how are you going to continue to do work? I think it's common, like, for businesses to lose power or businesses to lose their internet service or maybe computers to go down. And if they have customers sitting there expecting them to provide services, how are they going to continue doing that? And I often talk to people, like, in these conversations is, okay, how did you do it 50 years ago or 30 years ago or 20 years ago before technology was in place? And think about how you can continue operations and continue serving your clients in the event of any number of issues that happen. Because in the end, it's a responsibility of the company to both provide employment for their employees and to provide services to their clients or customers, no matter what happens.
All right. So what are the key components to a disaster recovery plan?
The first thing you need to do in any disaster recovery plan is really identify what you need to plan for continuing operations. Think about, okay, if a major event happens, what do we need to continue providing to our customers, clients, and our staff? And so that, kind of minimal operations. What is the most important thing that we need to do to continue forward? And then the next step is think about all the things that could happen to your organization. I mentioned some. It could be natural disaster. It could be power outages. It could be some type of cybersecurity event. It could be, health-related issues where your employees can't travel to your office, for example. And then, identify all those things you need to continue doing and to continue bringing money into your company, and then all the things that could potentially disrupt that. So that's really the beginning of creating a plan.
How does a business identify what their biggest risks are?
Well, I think think about, there's sometimes you can't think of everything, right? Maybe put them in major categories. For example, maybe environmental. So that could be, natural disasters, power outages, things that are, that are kind of out of their control, but are related to the environment. I think the next step would be maybe regulatory. So things that could happen to a company that could cause some problems. We're thinking like right now, we've seen, banks go under. So, if there's disruptions to the financial markets, to your bank, to your ability to collect money, that could go into another category. So kind of financial or regulatory. And then the final thing is the security. Well, maybe not the final thing. Maybe the third thing is security side of things, from a cyber side. So that would be a cyber attack, ransomware, IT outages, hardware failure of computers or servers, cloud outages, things like that. And then that would be another bucket. And then the final one is the human element. So, if there's some type of theft or break into your location, that's a kind of a human element. If your employees aren't able to work, or, major disruption to, the ability to people to come into the office, things like that. And so when you break it up into major categories, then you can go into subcomponents and think about, okay, how are we going to start mitigating some of those things, or what do we need to do to work around that? And there might be some things that you just can't. You have to have some type of insurance in place, or some things to really backstop the business in the event of a catastrophe that you can't solve in the immediate moment. And then the other side of it is think about working with some professionals. So your IT people can work with you on defining what would happen if these different things, these cyber events happen, and run some tabletop exercises like Leah talked about a couple of episodes ago of, okay, what happens if you have a ransomware? What are we going to do about it? And run through the steps through a tabletop exercise. And so just talk through it, write out the different plans. So you need professionals to help you through that. Same thing, with from a security standpoint, maybe talk to a security vendor or talk to an HR professional from a human element. So there's different professionals that you should bring in to discuss what you should do as a company to overcome those issues.
In your experience, are there any risks, that common things that businesses might not think of as being a risk, that they kind of they don't plan for because they're not really aware of it?
I think, when we talk about cybersecurity, we often think that the hackers are going to come into the business and, break through a firewall, or, bring down your server. But a lot of times, you got to think about the internal side of things, your employees doing things to damage your company internally, whether intentionally or not. So I think that's one of the areas that companies miss is thinking about the internal threats of their employees, whether it's, again, accidental or intentional that occurs. And then, of course, there's all the environmental side of things. As I mentioned before, power outages could cause problems, could cause disruption to your internet service, to your office. And there's a lot of things that could happen that's external that the companies can work through. So again, talking to your IT professionals, you can work through a lot of those issues.
Are there legal requirements for creating a disaster recovery plan?
There are, for some type of businesses, you have to have a disaster recovery plan in place. When you're, like Leah talked about before with the CMMC framework, some of these compliance frameworks require a disaster recovery plan. And then, of course, if there's any data that's lost in some type of, especially a cybersecurity event, there's legal responsibilities to report that to the appropriate, regulatory agency. So there could be, depending on the industry you're in, it could be regulatory requirements to have a disaster recovery plan in place. Also, going back to the insurance side of things, some insurance companies may require your company to have a disaster recovery plan in place before they'll insure you for even general liability insurance to the company. So having these plans in place might be required, depending on the regulatory agency, and then depending on what the insurance company asks you to do.
I imagine that's kind of changed. Have you seen that change over the years as far as requirements? Is that becoming more increased?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of these insurance companies today are requiring a lot more internal plans, policies, and procedures to be in place before they'll even insure companies. Or if you don't have them in place, they're going to charge you more money, as we talked about. So every year, the applications are becoming much more stringent with the insurance companies. And then, of course, the government is putting new regulations in place all the time. We see, like in the last year, the Federal Trade Commission put in these safeguard rules that were just in place with the banking sector, and now have come into place in the car dealership or the finance, the middleman of finance. And so the federal government and state governments are putting more regulations in place that require some of these plans to be in effect.
Along those lines, how often do you think or should a disaster recovery plan be reviewed by the company and by their IT professionals?
I think minimally once a year, the disaster recovery plan should be reviewed because things do change. And it's also good to keep it top of mind with the management team. Some regulatory requirements may make you do it more often than not. Do tabletop exercises maybe monthly for certain potential disasters. And you may want to do it more often than annually because there's maybe more environmental issues or critical infrastructure you're maintaining. So it really depends on what type of business you're in and the critical nature of your business. So, for example, if you're a hospital, it might be more important to do that more often because you're providing critical care to other people versus maybe a business that isn't as essential as a hospital is to continue operations.
And what kind of liabilities might a business be facing in the event of a disaster? Does it depend on what it is, what kind of disaster it is?
Certainly, like kind of going back again to the security aspect, the cybersecurity aspect of a disaster. If you're hit with a ransomware attack or any of your data gets out, there could be fines that are associated with release of information. And that could be, let's say, in the HIPAA environment with healthcare, those fines could be $10,000 per patient record in the state of California. And then federally, there would be additional fines. So this could, these type of fines for non-compliance of your own disaster recovery plan and security plans could range in the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars very easily. If you have the plan in place and you're following the plan and you're following your cybersecurity, following your disaster plans, and you implement it and follow it, the fines are usually not enforced because you're doing everything possible. I mean, the regulatory environment, insurance companies understand that they're there in place to protect as much as possible, but it's not 100%. So, there's other things that you can't plan for, that you can't mitigate 100% against or protect 100% against. But if you're doing everything possible, then those things don't come into play. Those fines and things don't come into place. So that's why having the plans and following your own plans is really essential to any cybersecurity, any disaster recovery plans. And then in the end, you want to continue servicing your clients. That's what brings in the money, because if you're out of business because of a cyber event or because of a major illness that goes through your location or loss of IT infrastructure, you can't service your clients. You might not be able to look up their information, and then you would have to go to your stopgap of your liability insurance to hopefully get some revenue back to pay your employees. So there's a lot of things that could happen if you can't continue in your business, that you could lose your whole company because of. And so having these in place, makes your company stronger so you can continue providing good employment for your employees and services to your clients.
Are there costs associated with creating the plan?
Obviously, there's time, internal time. So you'll need to have your management team, review these. So there's time involved. Most companies that will help you put these plans together, like Stimulus, they might be included in some type of security package or management package. So talk to your different professional groups, your attorneys, your CPAs, your IT professionals, and see what they have. But usually they would have some type of package that they could put together and help you put these plans in place. So certainly there's a cost, but it could be, kind of a part of a comprehensive security plan, which is the way that we do it at Stimulus.
And so if somebody's looking for somebody to help them with this, if they don't already have, an IT company in place, should they be looking? Are there companies that kind of specialize in different industries for this that they should be looking for?
Yeah, so definitely from an industry perspective, it's important if you are have to be compliant from a regulatory standpoint, you're going to want somebody that understands the regulatory aspects. So like Leah was on a couple of weeks ago with her CMMC, she really understands the DoD supply chain and the requirements that are related to that. So I'd look for a company that understands that if you are in that industry. Same thing with healthcare. I think it's really important to work with a company that is familiar with healthcare. And there's little niches that you have to look for. So I would look for a company that has those specializations. For Stimulus, we know general cybersecurity and we know nuances of, FTC safeguards, for the accounting and finance sector, for healthcare, we're familiar with those and we can help companies. But that's why I brought Leah on for the DoD supply chain, because we don't specialize in that. So having that in place really makes a difference of working with a company that knows that industry.
And one question to kind of wrap this up, what advice would you give to a business owner who was just getting started in creating their plan?
I'd say just get started. That's the hardest part, right? Sit down with your management team, spend an hour or two, just, again, creating those lists of, okay, this is what the minimal operations that we need to continue bringing dollars into the company. We need to be able to answer our phones or send emails, and we need to have our building working. What are the minimum things? And then, just brainstorm about the bad things that could happen to the company. And then even if it's just a few items like who to call, maybe some outside vendors to assist you. And that's what we did when we got started is, there was some critical infrastructure that we needed to make sure that we maintained, and just created a Word document of like, okay, paste it on the wall. If this happens, then, call Nathan first and then call these companies and then this is what we need to do. So just start writing things out and then review it and refine it over time. But the hardest part is to get started. And I think all companies should at least have something in place to continue operations in the event of a disaster.
All right. Well, thank you, Nathan, for the valuable information as always.
It's always fun to be here. And maybe next week it won't be for my kitchen, but we'll always be here.
And thanks everybody for listening.
All right. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, everybody.